guest assembly members, and we do have a senator that we anticipate coming. Please know that we sent out an invitation for this hearing to all 120 members of the legislature, and we had very little response from a different side that didn't that supports the global warming initiative and AB 32. And we're hoping that they have the availability to come to this hearing and ask questions of our distinguished guests that we have. I'm Assemblywoman Shannon Grove. I'm a freshman assembly member from Bakersfield, California, and I represent the 32nd Assembly District. And I'll let the rest of the panel introduce themselves, starting over here with Assemblymember Jones.
Hello, I'm Assemblymember Brian Jones from San Diego County.
Contra Shaja, representing the 33rd District, which includes San Luis Obispo County and Northern Santa Barbara County.
I'm Assemblyman Tim Donnelly. I represent the 59th District, which encompasses a huge portion of San Bernardino County as well as Los Angeles County.
I'm Assemblyman Dan Logue. I was the author of Prop 23, which was to suspend AB 32, and it is a great honor to have a gentleman as we have before us. It's my honor to even be on this panel. Thank you.
You guys want to introduce yourself as staff? No, you're good. This is our esteemed staff that is actually that really helps take care of us, guide us through this. I would like to take a moment and personally thank my staff, Rob Smith, Lindsay, and Christina, who put together this event and did such a I'd like to thank all of you for being here. In 2006, our state government passed Assembly Bill 32, known as the Global Warming Solutions Act. This bill called for the design and implementation of regulations to reduce California's CO2 emissions to 1990 levels by 2020. One of the major aspects of AB 32 is the carbon-based trading system, better known as cap and trade. Cap and trade is a complex system that has been tried in various places throughout the world and attempts to reduce CO2 emissions, thus slowing what many believe is a global warming caused by these emissions. I'm thrilled to introduce today two gentlemen who possess great knowledge on the issue that have agreed to speak today. These gentlemen will provide an international and local perspective of man's impact on climate and California's cap and trade system. So the two gentlemen that we have here testifying today are Tom Tanton, right here in Sacramento. He's graciously offered to speak today to provide a local perspective on the issue of climate change and cap and trade. Experience in energy technology and legislative interface, having been central to many of the critical legislative changes that enable technology choice and economic development at the state and federal level. He brings an invaluable amount of knowledge of California energy policy. He's a former senior fellow in energy studies with the Pacific Research Institute. Mr. Tanton currently serves as president of T2 and Associates, a firm providing consulting services to the energy and technology industries. He is also the Executive Director and Director of Science and Technology Assessment with American Tradition Institute. Mr. Tanton served as a guest lecturer for the Master in Environmental Science program at California State University, Sacramento, lecturing on power plant and electric grid technologies and their comparative environmental impacts. Thank you, Tom, for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Great privilege and honor to introduce someone that is extremely knowledgeable and has a great impact on the global warming conversation. Please welcome visiting with us from England, the Right Honorable Christopher Walter Monckton, 3rd Viscount Monckton of Brenchley. Classical architect and a public orator. He is a former special advisor to Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and is one of the world's most famous speakers on the man-caused climate change theory. He has organized and led various international climate conferences, having discussed the subject with President of the Czech Republic, spoken twice before representatives of the Chinese government, and has testified 4 times before the United States Congress. Most recently, Lord Monckton delivered the opening keynote speech at the first climate conference to be held at the official level in Colombia, and also gave talks in the United Kingdom, Ireland, and Sicily. He also gave a lecture on climate economics at the Prague School of Economics and participated in the United Nations Climate Conference in Durban, South Africa. Thank you, Honorable Lord Monckton, for being here today. Is that we are going to, Lord Monckton is going to speak first, and he's going to talk to us about a global perspective, and then Tom will finish up on the local perspective that we have in California. And then we'll take questions from the dais. If members have questions, they're able to ask. And then after the members have those questions asked, we'll take questions from the audience, and I'm sure both men will be glad to be able to participate with those questions. If you're participating from the audience, please raise your hand. Somebody will bring you a mic, I believe, or you can stand up and come to the edge microphone, and we will take some questions from the audience. So we will start. Lord Monckton, you have the floor.
Madam Chairman, distinguished Senator and members of the Assembly, ladies and gentlemen, it is always a pleasure to come to the United States, and it is always a particular pleasure to come to your great state of California. My job today, I think, is to outline the reasons why there is doubt about the very viability of the various measures, including the bill to introduce cap and trade, that your state has been bringing forward really rather on its own among the states and among the nations at this time. I'm going to begin with that part of the science of how much warming we are likely to get that is not yet settled. It is settled that if you add carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, you will get some warming. It is likely, therefore, that some of the warming that has happened over the past 50 or 60 years may be attributable to us. That much those of us who are doubters of the official position will happily and upfront concede. However, there is clearly a credibility gap between the amount of warming that has been observed, which is 1 Kelvin or roughly 2 Fahrenheit per century from 1950 to 2011. That means about 0.6, 0.7 Kelvin in that period. And what is predicted for the remaining 90 years of this century, which is at the equivalent rate of 3 Kelvin, or getting on for 6 Fahrenheit per century, which is predicted as the central case by the UN's climate panel, the IPCC. Now I start with this because it demonstrates, if you like, a central implausibility in what is being predicted. If we are only going to see warming at 1 Celsius per century, we don't really have a problem. Now it is agreed, the blue area there on the left, that we can, is there any way of bringing the focus down a bit so that that slide can be seen? That would be helpful. Thank you. It's agreed pretty much that on the left there, the science is settled, or very nearly settled, on how much warming we would get just from adding a certain amount of CO2 to the atmosphere. And that warming is just over 1 Celsius. Now one could argue with that a little bit, but essentially both sides tend to accept that that is likely to happen. Where the divergence comes between the two sides is on the question of the impact of what are called temperature feedbacks. Now the official position is that the feedbacks will multiply the original warming caused just by the CO2 roughly threefold. So instead of getting 1 Celsius of warming for a doubling of CO2 concentration, which is what we'd like to see this century, we get 3 Celsius. Whereas the skeptical side says, no, these feedbacks can't be measured, they're unlikely to be strongly positive for reasons I'll come on to, and therefore we're not likely to see much more than 1, 1 1/4 Celsius of warming for a doubling of CO2 concentration. The debate then, and there is one, there is not a consensus on this matter, is about what are called temperature feedbacks, these amplifications of the original warming, because the warming itself causes changes in the climate which trigger further warming. So the argument runs. So the big question is this feedback amplification equation the right equation? and that's the one you see on the screen at the top there? Or is it in fact the wrong equation? Should we be looking at much more of a homeostatic model by which the climate tends to stay very stable, and in particular the temperature tends to stay very stable within certain bounds, almost regardless of the stimuli that we or nature administer? And I'm sorry that the lettering hasn't come out terribly well on this. That word should say homeostasis at the top. And that means the tendency of the temperature to remain the same even if you push it in one direction or another. Here we go back for something like 750 million years. Madam Chairman will be too young to remember that far back. The point really is that you'll see that the temperatures don't vary by more than 8 Celsius degrees, about 12.5, 13 Fahrenheit, either side of the 750 million year mean. And that is only a 3% variance in absolute terms. It's very, very small. Now, of course, that's quite enough to take us from ice ages at one moment to a hothouse Earth at the next, and we're somewhere in between, rather towards the ice age side of things at the moment. However, there is a reason why, given that formidable temperature stability which we can infer from studies of the earlier climate, it is unlikely that the IPCC's range of estimates for temperature, which you see at the bottom right next to the pink box on the chart there, are at all likely. What you're looking at there is what's called the climate sensitivity curve. And it is the curve of the amount of warming you would expect for a doubling of CO2 if you were to take various values for what's called the closed-loop gain in the feedback system. And typically, we would expect in a temperature-stable system to see the feedbacks being negative. That's the green zone along the bottom left there. And so that you get perhaps somewhere between half a Celsius and maybe 1 1/3 Celsius of warming for a doubling of CO2 concentration. It's only if you go beyond that into the strongly net positive zone that you get the range of temperatures the IPCC predicts, 2 to 4.5 Celsius per doubling. But you see, that is very dangerously close to the point of instability in the feedback equation, where the climate sensitivity appears to shoot off the chart. We're going to take a closer look at that now. You will not see this anywhere in the peer-reviewed literature, though you will see it in the literature on the feedback equation. What happens is that there is a singularity in the equation at a loop gain of 1. And the literature says that beyond that, the climate sensitivity becomes undefined. We don't know what it is. Actually, we do know. It plummets, or it would, if the feedbacks inherent to the system were anywhere close to that central vertical line where the loop gain is 1. Now, I know this may sound a little bit complicated, but this is the guts of the scientific argument, which I just wanted to show you very briefly. Now, in practice, the climate has not behaved like this. It hasn't crossed backwards and forwards in what are called oscillations across that singularity. And that means that feedbacks really can't be anything like as strongly net positive as the IPCC maintains. And therefore, the amount of warming we get from a doubling of CO2 concentration cannot be much more than an entirely harmless and beneficial 1 Celsius over the coming century. And as you'll see, the record so far is a warming of exactly 0 Celsius since the beginning of the new millennium. Now, the next question that a good policymaker should ask is the science being put forward by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UN's climate panel, the IPCC, straight? Because if it isn't, then we're all wasting our time and, more importantly, our taxpayers' money.
When you say straight, you mean honest? I
mean straight and honest and fair and good and just and lawful and not criminal. Yes.
This is California.
I am
happy to accept the Senator's instruction. So here is a sine wave. Most of you will have played with these at school. And its trend, by definition, is 0, neither up nor down. Now, what we're now going to do is just look at that particular segment of the sine wave, because the trend in that segment of the sine wave is very slightly downwards. If we start right from the left-hand end of the screen, where the grey arrow is pointing, and go all the way to the right underneath the symbol, my logo there. Now, if we start at another trend line, a bit further to the right, a steeper decline, and still steeper, and still steeper. So what it looks as though we do, if we take the perfectly correctly calculated linear trends on the data for the various portions of the curve we're looking at, we appear to be getting a precipitate decline. And yet, we know from the very definition of a sine wave that the trend overall must be zero. And of course, we can change the cycle by 1/2 cycle of the sine wave, and suddenly we achieve precisely the opposite result, and it all appears to be rising. From this, we deduce that since the data are accurate, the plotting is accurate, the method is the same in both cases, but we've changed the starting points of the trend lines to suit whatever result we want to create. This is a bogus statistical technique. It is one that you may not use, for it will lead you into error. Now, you may say, what's this got to do with the climate? Watch and weep. This is the principal conclusion of the IPCC's 2007 fourth assessment report. It is the correctly displayed, if slightly vertically exaggerated, temperature trends globally over the past 160 years, with 4 very carefully chosen trend lines, all ending in the present but starting at carefully chosen places, so as to give the false impression that the rate of increase in global warming is itself accelerating, and therefore, as is stated twice in the report, that we are to blame.
Is this a hockey stick?
No, this is not the hockey stick. We'll come to that, sir. Since you have raised the question, I shall include the hockey stick for you. This is a completely different matter. It's a very serious statistical abuse. And this is the graph as it was perfectly correctly submitted. It didn't have a Viscount's coronet on it then, but it was perfectly correctly submitted to the IPCC's bureaucracy by the scientists in their final draft of the report. But that is what was published. And so we're seeing tampering with the work of the scientists when the IPCC's bureaucracy wants to achieve a more exaggerated result. And this very serious tampering at that. So here is what they sent in. There's a single perfectly correctly plate showing warming at the not particularly dizzying rate of 0.4 Celsius per century. Nothing to worry about there. Now, if we look at the 3 steepest periods of warming, we will see that their trend lines, again correctly calculated here, are just about identical. The parallel lines means the warming rates are the same at about 0.16 or 1/6 of a Kelvin, say a third of a Fahrenheit degree per decade. And these are obviously natural fluctuations of some kind, because CO2 has been increasing steadily a little bit more each year in the atmosphere. So these ups and downs can't be attributable to CO2. The overall warming trend might have some CO2 impact in it, but these ups and downs are natural. So they may, for instance, be to do with the, let's put them back again, the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, whose phases match this very well. But what you can see very clearly from this graph is that we are not looking at an acceleration in the warming rate. That is an improper conclusion to draw, and the IPCC used a bogus technique in order to draw it as its principal conclusion from the 2007 report. As a policymaker, I will be frank, I am disquieted by misconduct of this kind, and I cannot recommend to the governments whom I advise privately on this matter that they should have any regard to the science of the IPCC while it continues, despite repeated warnings, to behave in this unsatisfactory fashion. Well, now we're going to go to the 2001 report, and here, Assemblyman Lowe, we're going to look at the hockey stick. Now, in the 1990 report, there was a schematic. This is a colorized version of that, and there in the exclamation mark is where the medieval warm period was shown as being considerably warmer than the present. Perhaps ½ degree, 1 degree, even 2 degrees warmer than the present. You can see the Little Ice Age when it got very cold, and the Thames in London and the Hudson in New York used to freeze over every winter. And then you have that little pimple, which is today's temperatures. That was the understanding in the IPCC's first report. But here's what happened just a dozen years later. The graph was redrawn, and suddenly a huge exaggeration in the warming of the 20th century. They achieved that by considering the northern hemisphere only and excluding the southern hemisphere where the warming had been much less. So they've amplified the global warming by about 50%. That's thing number one. Thing number two, where the question mark is, the medieval warm period has gone, and further along between those two, the legislature has gone as well. Madam, do you have a question?
Yeah, so you're saying that the medieval warming period, you're saying that the medieval warming period is gone on the graph that was submitted?
Yeah.
The Ice Age as well?
That's right, they abolished them both. I'm going to show you how they did that. This is I dare say, if you take advice from the IPCC, you can walk on water as well. So here goes. What we're going to do now is we're going to look at how they did this and be prepared to watch and yet again weep. For this is I'm going to use a very blunt word here, so ladies, cover your shell-eyed ears. This is a bastardization of science, which should never have been allowed. Now, the first thing they did was they compiled that graph there from a variety, in fact, several hundred different paleoclimate reconstructions. In other words, we didn't have thermometers going back 1,300 years. So they had to find some ways of trying to guess what the temperatures were. And the ones that they used most vigorously and most often were different trees, which they would cut through with chainsaws and then count the rings to work out how old each ring was. And then the wider rings, they said, indicated global warming. Well, now, as Assemblywoman Grove was reminding me just this morning when we were discussing this, of course, you also get wider rings if it is wetter and also if you add CO2 to the atmosphere. So these, using tree rings, it's a kind of scientific voodoo, which the IPCC in its early reports said, whatever you do, don't do that. But it gave them such congenial results that they did it anyway. But it didn't give them the result they wanted. So what they did was to increase 390 times the weighting given to each tree that showed a nice apparent uptick in temperature in the 20th century. As you can see at the top there, that's actually one tree ring source, and the other one actually is from California at the bottom there, Maybury Slough, if I remember rightly. And there you'll see no uptick in the 20th century, so they didn't give that a very high weighting. So that was one dodge that they used to try to make the medieval warm period go away.
Okay, so just to clarify, they used the top one because the rings in the tree were wider, but the bottom one, the trees, the same type of tree for the same age was not wide. So
That's right.
They chose not to use the bottom.
So they used it, but they only gave it a weighting of 1,
Oh.
whereas they gave it a weighting, it was like counting the top one 390 times over when they were adding up the influences of each different tree. It's a very naughty technique. But it gets naughtier still, because even then it didn't get rid of the medieval warm period. So the next thing they did was to use a program for adding up all these different data sets and drawing the final graph, what's called an algorithm, which would give you the shape of a hockey stick, not much change for 1,300 years, and then suddenly an uptick in the 20th century. And even if you put what's called random red noise, which is a kind of random data into it, and you could do this over and over and over again, 99% of the time, it would give you the shape of a hockey stick, even if you didn't put a single correct data set in there. So that was the next thing they did. But it gets worse. Here, you can't see this terribly easily, but there's a grey faint line along the bottom there, which is the data that, the result that they would have got, or rather the result that they published is the one at the bottom. But the black one at the top is the one they would have got if they had excluded just 20 of the hundreds of tree ring data sets that they were using. It was those 20 and those 20 alone that gave the hockey stick shape and made the medieval warm period disappear. And these 20 were found by 2 Canadian researchers, one of whom I had dinner with last week to discuss this before I presented it to you here. And they were found on some computer material eventually supplied with a very bad grace by the authors of the original hockey stick graph after years of requests. And they found this file called censored data. So what they inferred from this, I think quite correctly, is that the authors of that graph had known that the entire abolition of the medieval warm period depended just on these 20 out of hundreds of trees. And that if you took those away, then the medieval warm period would show up in a graph compiled from all the other data sets.
Okay, just to clarify again, because I'm trying to follow it, I really am.
You're
saying
doing very
that
well.
they made this graph and this assessment based on 20 trees.
That's correct. If these 20 trees had been left out of the graph, which they compiled also from several hundred other data sets,
Right.
then the medieval warm period would still have shown up. That's the black line there.
What was the reason for excluding the trees?
Because it didn't leave the medieval warm period removed. They wanted to remove the medieval warm period.
Okay.
They had to exclude the 20 trees, or however much they tried to, I'm going to use the word, fiddle it, they wouldn't have succeeded. So this is what was done. And for years they resisted anyone having a look at what was done, and now you begin to see why. But these two Canadian researchers were so persistent that in the end a very muddled file was given to them. One of the two was an expert in unscrambling data that had been left in a mess. He spent years working through it, and in two crushing papers in 2005, they exposed this scam for what it was. Now, that wasn't good enough. They went on doing this. This is one of the emails that was found on the University of East Anglia's website by these called the climate change emails. And here they're talking among themselves. I've just completed Mike's nature trick, this is Phil Jones of East Anglia writing, of adding in the real temperatures to each series for the last 20 years, from 1981 onwards, and from 1961 for Keith, to hide the decline. Now let me tell you what hide the decline meant in this context. The raw data here is shown on this graph, and in black is the actual temperatures, which you see rise quite steeply in the second half of the 20th century. That's the line that pokes off right up there to the right. That's in black. Now, what you've then got is a line, for instance, in green for a few tree ring data sets supplied by a researcher called Dr. Briffa. And you will see that from 1960 until about 1980, suddenly 1990, suddenly there's a nosedive in that record, which is arrowed there so you can see it more clearly. So where the actual measured temperatures are rising rapidly, the tree rings appear to be suggesting that the temperatures ought to be falling rapidly. Now, of course, this was the most inconvenient result they could possibly have found, because what it suggests is that using tree rings, exactly as the IPCC had said many years ago, is a totally unsuitable way of reconstructing past temperatures, because you can't rely on them. So what they did was this. They fiddled the data. This is the World Meteorological Organization. Now you see the Briffa's graph, which with the real data ends up on the point of that arrow below there. It's then extended. There's actually a green line going all the way up to where that arrow is. It's actually about a 20th of a Celsius above where even the actual temperature had risen to. And this is what they did with three separate data sets. Two of them leveled off rather than rising, and the third, Briffa's, came down. They made them all go up to where that green arrow is pointing. And that, in an official publication of the World Meteorological Organization, one of the sponsors, the two sponsors of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Now, I'm going to show this to you more clearly, and then by all means, Assemblywoman, do ask the question. There's the before, the real data, and there is the after, as published by the World Meteorological Organization.
Is money connected to this in any way?
Very, very large amounts of money are connected to this in every way. You're quite right. The problem here is that large fortunes are being made by scientists who previously were just quietly doing their research on an ordinary scientist's salary, which isn't very great. James Hansen of NASA, for instance, one of the great trumpeters of this supposed alarm, earned more than $1 million last year. Michael Mann, the creator of the hockey stick graph, has had several $1 million in grants as a direct result of having shot to fame by publishing that graph before anybody found out quite how much was wrong with it. These people are making fortunes at the expense of taxpayers, and it is a sham and a scam and a scandal. And this is one of the plainest examples of, shall we just say, error in a scientific field that I have ever seen. Sir, you have a question?
I don't know if you can answer this. And it's the $1 trillion question. Who hacked the email?
Who hacked the emails? I can't possibly comment. Which is a smarty pants way of saying I actually don't know.
I think it is important to be clear, though. There's no evidence that the emails were hacked. They may have been leaked. But on a related note, the American Tradition Institute is currently suing the University of Virginia and Michael Mann under the Virginia Freedom of Information Act to release at least Dr. Mann's emails. The next hearing on that is April 6th.
Thank you. Lord Monckton has about 7 minutes left, and then we'll hear from Mr. Tanton. So.
Very good. I'm grateful for that point. So now, was there a medieval warm period? Again, I'm sorry that the text has gone off the screen here. We're using incompatible versions of the software, I think. But yes, there was, according to more than 1,000 scientists from more than 600 institutes in more than 40 countries who have published papers over the last 25 years giving evidence from various sources and various methods reconstructing past temperatures that the medieval warm period was real, was global, and was warmer than the present. So moving on then to the 1995 IPCC report, which we can deal with very briefly, that was the principal conclusion of the report. When will a man-made effect on climate change be identified? The answer is we don't know. They were very honest about it. That was what was submitted. But that's not the storyline you heard, because this is what was published. The body of evidence now points to a discernible human influence on global climate. There were 5 different versions of the before statement in the final draft sent by the scientists. All of them were removed. 200 consequential amendments were made by one man at the behest of the bureaucrats, and that was what was published. There is no scientific basis whatsoever for that conclusion, but that has been the official line ever since. So if anybody tells you there's a consensus, yes there is. It is a consensus of just one man. No questions, no. It's hard to do anything but weep at this point. So then, we're going to look now at the 1990 report very briefly. The first of the 4 quinquennial, multi-thousand-page assessment reports. Now, their principal conclusion is that we can use computer models to tell you what's going to happen to global temperature. Well, a generation has passed since then, members of the Assembly. And would you like to see how they got on with their prediction of temperature, for instance? They made 3 projections, high, medium, and low, red, yellow, and green there. The actual result, taken from the University of Alabama at Huntsville, is in black, and you'll see it falls below the lowest of their predictions. In other words, these models could not and cannot predict what is going to happen next. They seem to be curiously good at predicting what has happened in the past. Now, putting global warming in perspective, here are the temperature fluctuations for Boston, Massachusetts for 1 month in 2008. And the entire 20th century global warming is that very narrow orange band that goes right across the middle of the graph. That is how little the change in global temperatures has been over the 20th century. And that puts this somewhat into perspective. We can also see that they've been over-predicting by 4.5 times the rate at which the heat content of the ocean, one of the important components of the climate, would increase. They have vastly over-predicted sea level. It's rising over the last 8 years at a rate equivalent to just 1.3 inches per century, and that graph is taken straight off the Aviso Envisat satellite. That is the graph off their official website, just taken a few weeks ago, with their own trend line on it, and you can see there 0.323 millimeters per year, the equivalent of around 3 centimeters or 1.3 inches per century. Their figures, not mine. Everything you're seeing here is official, published, warranted data, peer-reviewed. Here is the accumulated cyclone energy index, which shows that in the green box at the right there, the amount of hurricane activity around the world, including tropical cyclones and typhoons, is less than it's been set record for 30 years. Here is the extent and trend of global sea ice from the University of Illinois. You'll see a little bit of a decline in the last 10 years or so, but nothing really to write home about, because the Antarctic ice has made up for some of the loss in the Arctic ice. You'll see that methane is Ag Day today here, and I was talking to 1 or 2 concerned farmers outside, and they said, what about this cow fart tax? I'm pleased to tell you that the methane concentration, as measured at Berry Head in Australia by the Bureau of Meteorology there, has been rising at only 20 parts per billion since the year 2000, when Putin finished repairing the methane pipeline from Siberia, which was the main cause, we think, of methane increase. Now that that's been stabilized, not much increase in methane. That would cause, by the end of the century, maybe 1/350th of a Celsius degree of warming. So leave the cows alone. Now,
Yeah, and just so that Californians get it, it's methane in California.
and when you've learned English, it's methane. And they've also identified in the 2007 IPCC report what they call the fingerprint of human-made global warming, which is a hotspot, a tripling of the surface warming rate only in the tropics, only if we are the cause of the warming. That's the modeled or predicted version, top left. Bottom right is the Hadley Centre's actual measurements, and you'll see the hotspot isn't there. So if they were right, which they're probably not, to find this, the fingerprint of global warming, well, it doesn't exist, and therefore the warming isn't our fault. Likewise, the amount of radiation escaping to space is predicted to fall as temperatures rise by the 11 models all the way around the edge of this graph, but the actual measurement from the Irby and Ceres satellites shows an increase in the amount of radiation escaping to space. That means we're going to get far less global warming than has been suggested. Perhaps it could be as little as kind of 1.5 Fahrenheit for a doubling of CO2 concentration. Now, very quickly, I want to deal with the economic considerations, and here I'm going to take as my example California's carbon tax, which is a worrying case study. Now, unfortunately, here we have terrible trouble with the equipment. I can't show you any of the figures, which is a real shame. So, may I have a copy of my brief here? I'll try and do it from this. I'm going to read this to you because it's simpler than showing these slides. We have old-fashioned equipment here in California. Now, California's carbon tax, together with other statewide measures to curb CO2 emissions, will cost $450 billion by 2020. That's $182 billion for the tax itself, according to a university study published just last week. And you multiply that approximately 1.5 times over for the knock-on effects in the general economy, including the various other measures that are being implemented. Now, even if this were to succeed fully, as had been wished by those putting forward this tax, then that would reduce California's emissions of CO2 by 25% over the next 10 years, by 2020. And that in turn, because California is only 8% of US emissions, and US are only 18.7% of global emissions, means that 0.4% of global carbon emissions would have been remitted by the end of the period of the tax. And that, you'll be glad to hear, will reduce what would otherwise be the business as usual 413 parts per million of CO2 concentration to, wait for it, 412.9. Now this in turn, of course, is what determines how much global warming you forestall. And hold your breath, because it's really exciting. It's just 1/1000th of a Fahrenheit degree will be abated by this measure. Madam, yes?
Okay, so you're saying that you have scientific evidence that shows the economic impact will cost Californians $450 billion to implement this to 2020, and it will affect the global warming by 1/1000th
of a Fahrenheit degree.
Of 1 Fahrenheit.
That is correct. I do hope you all think that's value for your taxpayers' money, but I'm old-fashioned, and I think in Britain we would raise some pretty severe questions about that kind of squandering of money. It makes no sense at all. I'm sorry I can't show you these equations properly. Yes?
Is that analysis based upon the fact that California, like usual, is going it alone?
That is part of the problem, but only part of it. What I've done here is to assume very generously that everybody else might join in, and we're going to look at that now, because it's a very fair question. And that is a point that the other side would most certainly raise, and so Senator Logan, you would raise a fair point there. And here we look at what would happen if you were trying to forestall 1 Celsius of global warming driven by CO2 by measures implemented worldwide as cost effective, or as you may think, ineffective, as those of California? And the answer is $454 trillion would have to be spent to forestall 1 Fahrenheit degree of global warming. And just to forestall 0.3 Fahrenheit that would otherwise be expected to occur between now and 2020, according to the IPCC, the cost, if you did it by Californian methods, would be $180 trillion, or $25,500 per head of the global population just between now and 2020. That is 1/3 of global GDP over the period, and these are on the most optimistic assumptions about the success of the policy and about the discount rate that you use for future expenditure. And so the bottom line of this is the action-inaction ratio. 33% of GDP is what it would take to make global warming go away by methods as cost ineffective as those of California. 3% of GDP is the maximum cost, undiscounted, that the Stern report finds would be applicable by the end of this century if we did nothing. That's all it would cost. If we get no more from the warming of 3 Celsius than the IPCC predicts, 3% of GDP is what it would cost, 33% of global GDP is what it would cost. It is therefore an order of magnitude, a factor of 10 or 11, more expensive to act now on CO2, even if you assume that the warming is every bit as great as the IPCC tells us. And we've already seen that that assumption is not justified. So the economic conclusions are very blunt. No policy to abate global warming by taxing, trading, regulating, reducing or replacing greenhouse gas emissions will prove cost effective solely on grounds of the welfare benefit from climate mitigation. You would have to have some pretty good other reasons for doing this in order to justify it. So,
have you done any analysis on what you think this will do to the cost of energy, in particular gasoline or fuels in California?
I think that's Mr. Tanton's subject, and I shall be glad to defer to him on that matter. Now, therefore, CO2 mitigation strategies that are inexpensive enough to be affordable will be ineffective. Strategies costly enough to be effective will be unaffordable. Focused adaptation is better. In any case, the West is no longer the problem. You see that purple line there? That's the United States' predicted course for future carbon emissions. And look at China in that red cartouche there. That's where China is going to go. Where did Dr. Archibald get those figures from? He got them, at my suggestion, from the annual statistical communiques of the People's Republic of China. They're planning to open a new coal-fired power station every week. So,
wasn't Copenhagen, didn't they exclude China?
What happened is that China at Copenhagen refused to play, and that's why the deal broke down. That's what happened. I actually was there. I was one of the only non-party delegates to get in. I'm glad to say it was the US Republican delegation that kindly swept me in on their coattails when everybody else was excluded, so that I was able to watch Mr. Wen Jiabao, who is the State Council President of China, explaining to President Obama and to everybody else that China had had quite enough of this nonsense and was not going to play. And there is what they are going to do. And you can see that whatever we do isn't going to make any difference anyway. Now, the costs, therefore, to California are enormous. There are no benefits to anyone. I've run through these figures before, so I won't do them again. The premium greatly exceeds the cost of the risk. So, as they say in the London market, don't insure. Not a single penny should be spent on this at all. So now you have a self-inflicted wound here. Too many environmental regulations, cost ineffective cap and tax. You have costly renewable energy mandates. You've had a 40-year moratorium, just about, on nearly all offshore drilling. And here is what this is doing to you. You've got 15 billion barrels of oil sitting in the Monterey Shale. I met the member from there recently. He didn't even know it was there. And the production has fallen, as you'll see, very sharply since 1990. And it's over-regulation that's causing the problem. You have 11% jobless in California, the second highest in the United States. Your treasury deficit, $6 billion. Your unfunded pension liabilities to your old people, $250 billion, and rising very rapidly every year. 1/3 of all your high net worth Californians, according to the Sacramento Bee published here, fled California in just 2 years, 2007, to national economic sense. The wagons are rolling eastward. If the big high net worth individuals are going, so is the companies. Here we are. Twice as many firms fled California in 2011 as in 2010. There was a misprint on my written remarks here. The second of those figures should be 2010. Intel says it will never build another plant in California. Global Star, Trizetto, and EI, three very big companies, fled in just 1 month recently. Boeing, Toyota, Apple, Facebook, DirecTV, all are gone. And far more are thinking of going.
So I'll let you know that, and I appreciate you bringing this up, but Intel put up $1 million against our ballot measure to suspend AB 32 and left town the next day and went to Oregon. And then also Apple opened up a plant in North Carolina and they came out against suspending AB 32. So a lot of these companies are saying we need to do it here, but they're leaving the state.
I think that is very, very fair comment. I think they're playing politics against the middle in their usual way, but the fact is that nobody is going to go on doing business here. If I'm going to be blunt here, I hope you'll forgive me, Senator, but this, really we're dealing with economic nonsense here, and it will drive everybody away if it carries on. There is also the global moral dimension on which I propose to end. This is a picture from National Geographic. This is even before the tragic earthquake in Haiti. They were living, as you will see here, on mud pies made out of real mud. Our fellow citizens of this planet, not that far from here. Mud pies made with real mud. And these mud pies used to cost 3 cents each, until the biofuel scam doubled world food prices. And they're 6 cents each, and so people began dying in very large numbers because they could afford 3 cents and not 6 to buy mud pies to live on. Our fellow citizens of this planet. Here is what Jean Ziegler, the UN's Right to Food rapporteur, had to say about this in 2007. When millions are going hungry, it is a crime against humanity that food should be diverted to biofuels. So you can start out, I submit, by getting rid of any further nonsense about biofuels in the state of California. Stop it at once. You should likewise stop the windmills which are killing the birds in their thousands at Altamont Pass in California. You can forget the solar panels, look at what happened to Solyndra. All of these so-called renewable energies are hundreds of times more expensive to implement than just using good old-fashioned fossil fuels. This lady had her sight restored for $8. Does she look sad about that? She's delighted. She had trichiasis. This is where the trachoma parasite infects the eye and causes the eyelid to grow inwards, piercing the eyeball. It's one of the most intensely painful illnesses known to man, and eventually you go blind. For $8, these people can be saved from that, but we are diverting, even in this state, hundreds of billions towards a completely wasted policy of trying to make global warming go away. Are we going to allow this to happen? Here are the children of Africa staring at you with their hopeless, hopeful eyes. They need help now. They need to be given food now, clean water now, safe sewerage now. They need health care today. They need housing at once. They need safe energy, fossil fueled energy, because it's the cheapest way to lift them out of poverty and thereby to stabilize their population. All you have to do is bring up the standard of living and their populations will stabilize, and then it becomes possible for them at last to prosper as we have done. But if we deny them all this, because we make fossil fuels an enemy, then we kick the very poorest people of the planet in the teeth. And that, I know, to the people of California, is something that they will find entirely unacceptable, and that they, through you, would like to put right as soon as possible. And so, if I may, I shall end by citing the words that Winston Churchill spoke to your president in the darkest hour before the dawn in the Second World War. Sail on, O ship of state. Sail on, O Union strong and great. Humanity with all its fears, with all the hopes of future years, is hanging breathless on thy fate. Thank you.
Lord Monckton has put me in quite a dilemma. And that dilemma is, he's a tough act to follow. What I want to talk about is the other half of good public policy. The first half of good public policy is doing the right thing. And Lord Monckton has indicated that perhaps we're not doing the right thing. The other half of good public policy is doing the thing right. And I'm here to testify about how we're doing the thing absolutely wrong in every single instance. Lord Monckton has talked about how large the temperature increases might be if the models are correct. And what, for the last 10 years, has never ceased to amaze me is in a state that purports to be so progressive, relies on a regressive model. The way the IPCC model is developed is through a mathematical approach called regression, and it regresses on the database. And Lord Monckton has indicated that the database is, to put it bluntly, quite suspect. So any results are quite suspect. He's already indicated that this is all pain and no gain. But the cap and trade program makes things even worse. You've written eloquently, Assemblywoman, about economic leakage. The people leaving the state, the businesses leaving the state, the economic downturn as a result. In addition,
I just want to interrupt you to let the audience know that economic leakage in political terms is job loss to the state of California. That's what they call job loss, economic leakage.
Thank you. People are leaving the state, they're taking their jobs with them. Businesses are leaving the state, they're taking their jobs with them. In addition, because California is already the third best state in the nation, carbon intensity, i.e. how much carbon do we emit per dollar of GDP, the United States is 4 times better than China. We ought to be implementing policies that encourage people to stay here, create jobs here, and be productive here. For every ton of cement that we buy from Arizona, and every basket of fruit that we buy from Chile, and every techno-gadget that we buy from Asia, we're increasing global emissions of CO2. We're going backwards. In addition, the Renewable Portfolio Standard is implemented, to use a friend terminology, bass backwards. We have a 33% renewable portfolio standard in California. And the reason we have a 33% renewable portfolio standard is because we couldn't meet the prior one of 20%. More importantly, it is almost exclusively being filled with intermittent renewable technologies. And those intermittent renewable technologies, like wind and solar, impose operational constraints on the rest of the grid. All the other power plants have to ramp up and ramp down and turn on and turn off in response to 5-minute swings in power production from wind turbines. We've seen in Colorado, we have seen in Denmark, we have seen in Germany, we've seen in Ireland, and I think we've seen in Australia, but I'm not sure yet, that at certain levels of intermittent technology penetration into the grid, total fuel consumption goes up, total CO2 emissions go up. Such a study has never been done in California, but we go off willy-nilly and implemented the 33% renewable portfolio standard. As Executive Director and Chief of Science and Technology Assessment at the American Tradition Institute, we have filed a suit in the state of Colorado Federal District Court challenging that state's renewable portfolio standard because they cannot demonstrate local benefits that would exceed the violation of the Commerce Clause in the U.S. Constitution. Implementation of AB 32 is the most regressive tax that I've had the displeasure of being associated with in my 40 years in California energy policy. The size of AB 32 and cap and trade in particular make the energy crisis of 2000 pale in comparison. We're talking 10 times worse than the energy crisis of 2000. In fact, in 2000, we never had an energy crisis. What we had was a capacity crisis. And I won't get into the details, but we had plenty of energy. We just had it in the wrong place at the wrong time. In answer to Assemblyman Donnelly's question, Many Americans are wringing their hands today about the high cost of gasoline. Rightly so. It's gone up, and it's gone up pretty high. The implementation of AB 32 is bigger on an impact per family of 4 than the current high prices of gasoline. Overall, and while it depends on if you're talking transportation fuels or electricity, as a rule of thumb that you could use in your campaign speeches or wherever you might want to use it, bigger energy prices would increase about 30%. Now this is in addition to the fact that energy prices in California are above the national average and above our nearest neighbors, Arizona, Nevada, et cetera, which explains to a large degree for manufacturing why businesses are leaving. You know, their cost of production includes a hefty dose of energy in their cost of production.
It's roughly, I believe it's the second highest cost they have after labor for most manufacturers. But would you go into a little bit of detail on some of the other fuels that will be impacted if you could?
Well, the first, I don't call it a fuel, but electricity is going to be impacted about probably 35 to 40%, largely as a result of the renewable portfolio standard and its indirect effects. Indirect effects of buying balancing power, additional fuel at balancing plants, et cetera. Gasoline is always kind of hard to predict, but transportation fuels anywhere in excess of 25%. But it reminds me, you know, everybody's kind of pointing their finger at the oil companies, you know, for making large profits. But for every dollar the oil companies, oil and gas companies receive in profit, the government takes $6. So maybe we got to be looking at the tax more seriously than at the profits that oil and gas companies are making. We're also talking about the loss of a significant number of jobs. My estimates are of approximately 485,000 jobs lost as a result of implementing just the cap and trade provisions of AB 32. Now, back in March of last year, there was a hearing over at ARB, and they, you know, Mary Nichols brought people that had made predictions about job losses or job gains. Well, I gave mine, and of course, you can imagine what the response to my predictions were. As it turns out, my predictions were consistent with the Energy Information Administration, the Congressional Budget Office, and the Environmental Protection Agency when they looked at similar proposals at the federal level. What would happen to jobs and what would happen to economic development? That report is available at the AB 32 Implementation Group's website, or let me know and I'll send you a copy. This is important. Without cap and trade, without renewable portfolio standards or renewable electricity standards, from 2000 to 2010, the U.S. economy improved its carbon intensity by 17%. We are 4 times better than China. We should be exporting things to China rather than importing things from China.
And they do go to China or other states that are not within this system. Well, it doesn't matter if that system is applied or not. If China will produce more emissions just without our cap and trade system or our RPS system, producing a widget or producing a, you know, for instance, dried garlic or whatever, than we would even without these systems in place.
I think
correct.
Yes.
And our productivity would continue to improve without our implementation of these programs.
Just because it's our nature to improve.
Yes. If I'm a business and I'm competing against Lord Monckton's business, how do I capture market share?
You don't.
I capture market share by being more productive.
I think a couple of things. The Chinese are getting, the Chinese are getting better for the same reason that we are. I mean, they're buying more efficient plants because they're trying to improve their productivity the same way that we are. They started off so far behind so that the marginal increases that they make are much more dramatic because They started from so much further back. I mean, most of their infrastructure, particularly on the energy side, combined cycle plants and the like, I mean, there essentially are 3 people in the world who make them, and 2 of them are here, not in California, but Westinghouse, General Electric, and Siemens. I mean, so if you've got a combined cycle plant, typically you got it from one of those 3. And then there's Babcock and a couple of other people who make a couple of the other parts that go into them. I think I would agree. I mean, I've listened to a lot. I guess I probably look different here. First of all, I don't see any other black folk, and the panel is all Democrats.
We didn't notice.
I know I fooled you for a long time, though. I wasn't going to tell you at first, but I figured that out. I think, I mean, there are a couple of things too as well. I mean, certainly Lord Monckton, I think the idea when you look at Greenland demonstrates that there was a medieval warming period. So it doesn't take a climate scientist to know that they didn't call it Greenland because it had ice on it.
Well, actually, it is. It wasn't beyond that.
But I mean, when you go and you look under the tundra, there were vines and they planted stuff. It was not as much of a glacier as it was a long time ago. The ice there is probably 700–800 years old. I mean, there was some. And remember, the people who moved there, it's not like they were moving from Bermuda. I mean, the place that they left was also very cold, so it was not like that was a climate that they were unaccustomed to. Conversely, I think on the Ice Age, the evidence becomes the plague. The reason in part that the plague occurred is because people moved inside and so did the rats, and the rats brought with them the fleas, and the fleas bit people when they were inside. I mean, so you actually have demonstrable evidence of both the warming and the cooling period. What I hope as well we can do, I mean, it's like as I listen to the crisis, having worked here in this building during the energy crisis, is you had a variety of things that took place that caused the crisis. It was not simply Enron gaming the system, which is kind of an easy scapegoat, but we're so hooked on episodic TV that it's easy to blame a villain. Several things occurred during that period of time, and it wasn't simply a capacity issue. You had 2 nuclear plants were down. That was an unusual occurrence at the same time. Additionally, you had a heat period that occurred. Because you disaggregated the ramp up of the plants into a seasonal format, plants that would have normally been down for repairs ran during the repair period because it was profitable for them to do that. And then when you got to the point where you really needed those plants that would have normally been down for scheduled maintenance, they had to go down for maintenance at an odd time. And when you couple that with the new plants that were down, both in San Onofre, Songe 2 and Diablo Canyon, there were a number of convergences that made that happen, in addition to the stupidity of having what's called a net short position that exceeded the industry standard of 12%, ours was 70%. Well, Ray Charles could see that that's not a sustainable margin, and that also became a big challenge. I wanted to point out too, I'm doing this, I'm supposed to be at 2 places at once, and my machine that allows me to do that is broken, but one of the other things I hope that you would have mentioned as well is that the modeling that's described to predict climate change doesn't work. I mean, Nathan Myhrvold and a couple of other people who are computer guys have made it clear. We don't yet have a computer, and we can't replicate the climate model in such a way that you can predict anything, which is why they're typically wrong, but they're generally guessing because they don't know. The other thing is that the points that you made relative to the data, Fred Singer and the other group that did the study on the IPCC after the East Anglia debacle, they pointed out much of what you said. The data in the report, if you want to read a thing that big, the data is actually accurate. It's the executive summary and the conclusions that are drawn that are bogus, which is what Fred Singer was the president of Princeton, and he actually had a group that was called the on climate climate change that reviewed the intergovernmental. And he said, data's good, the conclusions don't match what ultimately became the press releases. So you had these press releases that predicted all this gloom. I mean, if you look here at that with polar bears, one would think that the ice melted, that the polar bear would drown. The polar bear can swim 20 miles. So if you drop the polar bear in the middle of the ocean, that just means he'd have to swim someplace to go get something to eat. The biggest threat to polar bears is people shoot them because they're moving further south because there's so many of them that they don't have enough habitat in which to play. I mean, I've spoken much longer. I mean, I think the points you make are good ones. I mean, the challenge that I would say on the renewable energy is, you're right, relative to the intermittent, just non-dispatchable nature of wind and solar, and meaning you can apply to that two other terms. One would be capacity factor, and the other would be the availability factor. I mean, the availability factor of a solar unit ain't but like 6%. So that means that 94% of the time, you got to get it from someplace else. You're absolutely right relative to the ramping up, although the newer units actually do that better. Because, but California did our program as backwards. We actually are using a median age power plant that goes back some 30 years. If you were to use newer power plants, you actually could ramp them up and down without the waste of energy that you're describing. But since today, you almost have to like pull out all your teeth to get the permit to build the new combined cycle plant. We should be getting rid of all of the 40 and 50-year-old plants, going to the newer plants that can follow load in a much more economic fashion. But it's a challenge getting through. And most people don't realize is that even when you begin talking about the energy emission in California, we don't count the hydro within what we call the renewable. And since damn near 30% of the electricity that we produce comes from hydro, which by the way has no emissions whatsoever, and you've got almost 20% in California that comes from the nuclear side. So we really are right now at a 50% real renewable group, not counting the 5 or 6% that we do on non-dispatchable combined cycle sources. I've spoken too long, Madam Chair. I didn't mean to take up the time, but I appreciate the work that certainly that both of you do. I mean, the other thing that I was thinking that you would have mentioned is that in your country, our Goldman Sachs has already cornered the market on what was little none of your cap and trade money, so they already stole that and are gone, and are looking pretty much to get the rest of it. I mean, and so, I mean, what you create is a marketplace of cash that essentially goes to Wall Street, who, by the way, fund all of the stuff that goes into making this work. It is not, I mean, to your point, Madam Chair, it is not by accident that you look up and all the TV stations who happen to all be owned by the same people who stand to make the cash are essentially trying to push a thing that allows those entities to make more money. I mean, because we're pretty much now to the point where we're going to charge people to breathe. I mean, when you cut to the chase. I hope that what we don't get confused with is the idea that we should use energy more efficiently. In fact, we should. I mean, it is not like you just want to say, well, I'm going to burn diesel in this room. That probably wouldn't be a good idea. But I don't think that anyone would suggest that. You know, should we look at making cars run? Well, absolutely we should. And I agree with you, sir, that the progression of science in this country is such that we've made things better. I mean, the reason that lead was added to fuel wasn't because people like putting lead in fuel, but you needed to make the fuel burn more completely, and you needed to make the valves skip, because then they would break and then your engine would go down, and that was kind of problematic. And so lead was added so that the fuel burned more completely and you didn't have knocking. Once you resolved the knocking issue, then you could take the lead out. Once you could take the lead out, then you could put the catalytic converter on, because the catalytic converter wouldn't work because the lead would react against the platinum in the catalytic converter and burn it up. But once you took the lead out, then you could put the converter on, the catalytic converter took out the sulfur, and you made that engine run much more efficiently. It wasn't because of regulation, it was just because science achieved what it was able to do. We want to continue pushing science. I mean, I hope that there's not a thought to say that we want to go back to the horse and buggy. but you want to go forward with science as efficiently as you can so that you're doing it in the right way. You don't want to create a law that says that 30,000 people are going to die if you drive a diesel truck down the 5 freeway. Because the guy who wrote that, A, didn't get a doctorate from UC Davis. B, we now know that that data was fatally flawed. And he's still working that car. Now, if I did that, I'd probably get life. Hell, I got people trying to give me life over which of my own damn houses I live in.
Thank you, Senator.
So, I mean, but I say that in a global sense, there's a great deal of work to be done. And so, as I guess the only Democrat on the panel, I agree and have certainly, been involved and read much of your work in the past. So I appreciate what you're doing.
Thank you, Senator. I'll let you guys respond in just one second. I wanted to reassure Senator Wright missed the introductions. We did invite 120 members to participate, and so we thank you for coming. And we did invite Senator Padley and Ms. Skinner, and several other people that are experts on the climate change issue, and they declined, but I really appreciate you coming and being a part of this discussion. And as we all tell Senator Wright most often is that he truly is a Republican, he just not has accepted that yet. Senator, for participating, because truly he is a fair and balanced individual that truly cares about this issue. So thank you, Senator, very much. Would you guys like to respond to that?
Yeah, very briefly. I appreciate Senator Wright being here and more importantly, remembering some of the discussions we had about what the real energy crisis in 2000 was about. More importantly, I'd like to address your comment about China. Yes, China is advancing their science and their technology, and they're moving forward. They have not yet caught up with us, but I can guarantee you they will catch up to us faster if we're going backwards. And that's exactly what we're doing. We're reducing our productivity, and that is going to have them catch up that much faster.
No, I wouldn't disagree. I mean, the challenge that California faces on a really big scale, and we're backing into something that we actually want to face forward, I believe, is this state grew because of manufacturing and the fact that you could buy a house. Those were the two driving forces that made California grow. If in fact we're going to make a policy decision that we no longer want to be in manufacturing, and that we're going to go to services and away from it, then we should tell the rest of the people who are trying to make stuff here to get out. And at least make an honest reflection of what we perceive the policy to be. But to literally bleed companies to death one at a time or drive them away in a kind of ad hoc fashion isn't fair, nor is it good public policy. I mean, so if we're not going to make airplanes, I mean, I grew up in an era when one of every 3 jetliners that flew in the world was made in Southern California. Today it's 0. If that's what we want, then we should say that and say to everybody else, you should get out, as opposed to watching them just leave one at a time. And I took way too much of the chair's time.
One other quick comment. Often when things go awry, like methyl tertiary butyl ether, MTBE, or the initial, oh my God, corn ethanol is a savior for our low carbon fuel standard. There are probably 1,000 other examples. You often hear the excuse of, well, that's an unintended consequence. Well, I'm sure they didn't mean it, but there is a difference between unintended consequences and unanticipated consequences. They don't have to listen to me all the time. Once in a while. You know, I pointed out in January, before the governor announced the low carbon fuel standard, that ethanol was a bad bet in terms of carbon emissions life cycle. Did anybody listen? No. What it suggests is developing policy and regulations more on a probabilistic basis rather than a deterministic basis. The regulators in charge of implementing the regulations pick an answer. They pick a answer. They shouldn't pick a answer. They should pick a breadth, a distribution of answers, and develop policies that are good under any of those possible answers.
Thank you. And Lord Monckton, you have a comment, sorry.
Well, first of all, I'm enormously grateful and honoured that the Senator came and devoted so much time and thought to addressing our modest presentations here today. I very much agree with him that the models don't work, not least because they're not peer-reviewed. Just like the IPCC's documents themselves, the models which constitute 9/10 of their case are not peer-reviewed. And I might just end my comments with one little quotation which really encapsulates how difficult it is to make the models work. Since the climate is a coupled, non-linear, chaotic object, the long-term prediction of future climate state is not possible. And my authority for this is the IPCC itself. Thank you, Senator.
I have a couple of questions from the dais, but as people are leaving, because we have exhausted our hearing time, I do want to tell you that both of these gentlemen will be appearing at Sac State this afternoon at the Hyde Auditorium, Student Union at 7 p.m., and we will have that facility for a longer period of time for more question and answers.
Citizens, business owners, what's the takeaway?
I think the first thing to do is to educate the officials, because they will often be, potentially at least, less unreasonable than those who have forced this bill through both houses of your legislature. The art is to make sure that the officials meet, for instance, with me, so that I can take them through the numbers and explain where I got them from. And after all, I have presented these numbers at the Los Alamos Climate Conference at Santa Fe last December. I'm going to present them to the World Federation of Scientists Conference on Planetary Emergencies this August. These are numbers which are being taken seriously by governments around the world. They're quoted by heads of state. And at the moment, California is like a kind of bubble where what is happening in the rest of the world is that people are beginning to wise up that even if there were a climate problem, economically speaking, it's still better not to do anything about it now. They need to be exposed to these arguments, to understand how the equations work, to understand how the sums are done, and even to call in their own economists to examine the figures that I've presented, so that they will see that, if anything, I have been too generous to California in assuming that these schemes will be much more successful than I personally think they will be. And once the officials understand just how far from making any sense, economically speaking, these proposals are, I think you'll find they will then be able to convince their masters in the Democrat administration. And one thing is very important here, that in the theology of the enviro-Marxist hard left, it is absolutely a no-no to say that you don't believe we have a problem with the climate. So that's why my approach on the economics is to say, okay, let's pretend ad argumentum that the problem is every bit as big as the usual suspects tell us it is. Economically, it doesn't work. That is an argument to which their minds are not yet closed. And it does seem to me to be the best avenue that you get me in to meet the officials, work with them, explain the equations to them, take them through it until they understand the arguments in detail. And then I think they will be forced to come to the same conclusion I have, and very rapidly thereafter they will say to the Democrats, look, really this doesn't make any sense, not even as a revenue raiser. It's just going to fail. And if we carry on down this road, then there will be disaster for the state of California, and surely we all want to avert that.
I think there's a couple of other things that, in addition to that excellent suggestion, you might want to consider. The first is to eliminate term limits. And the reason I suggest that is I want all the members that put that bill in place to still be around when it fails. Second, perhaps, but more seriously, when AB 32 was passed, the legislature relinquished its authority of oversight. And in retrospect, that was the worst thing they could have possibly done. Even worse than passing the bill as a policy. What you need to do is put in place some sort of unbiased or balanced or some sort of scientific panel that would oversee the work of the ARB and its cohorts. Now, they have a scientific panel, but they've been around for a long time. They've been somewhat co-opted by the bureaucracy of the ARB. Put in place a fresh one with some real reporting requirements and authority to the legislature. Make it an arm of the analyst office. Do something, but rest oversight and control away from the ARB. That would be my serious suggestion.
Thank you. Yes, Member Jones.
I'm glad you mentioned that because I brought that issue up a couple weeks ago in the Budget Sub-3 Committee, which is Transportation and Resources.
Right.
And we've continuously asked for the director of CARB to come and speak to us at that committee, and repeatedly we've been stiff-armed on that request. And so, one of the comments that I made in that committee hearing, and I'll repeat them here, is that CARB right now acts as a rogue agency. They're well beyond their authority, from what I understand that this legislature gave them. The commissioners and the directors believe that they are the end-all of the authority of that department, and what they falls on this legislature for allowing them to get away with it and not having that oversight. So I thank you for your comments, and I think that as more and more of the general public understands that, because I believe that, a lot of the public's been deceived into thinking CARB is the end-all of their own authority, which they're not. So, and as more and more citizens and voters become aware of that, we'll be able to rein them in. So,
well, I certainly look forward to assisting you in your efforts, however they might mature. I tried to help Senator Dutton a few years back when he had a similar sort of thrust. So there's, I'll help however I can.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any more questions that you have to ask? We're going to, so if you have a question, please stand up here next to this microphone. We will get to as many of you as possible, and we'll try to keep questions brief and answers just as brief and directed to the point. And so we'll start right here, Kevin.
Thank you, Assemblywoman. My name is Kevin Dayton. I was one of 38 members of the City of Roseville Sustainable Action Committee. Roseville is a suburban town of Sacramento, about 110,000 people. And I didn't really know much about this, but I found out that what's happening is that the state legislature and the CARB and the Sacramento area regional council, Sacramento area council of governments, all of the actual implementation of reducing these emissions is largely being shifted to the 5,300 local governments in the state. And what happened was this committee of 38 was mainly full of people who, as mentioned, had the environmental theology of the far left. It was very difficult trying to maneuver through this group and try to start with a produce a report that wasn't filled with all sorts of global warming language in it. We finally put it out, and the city council approved it. But the city council pointed out, we're going to be getting blamed because of all that we're being forced to do here in this city to do what the state imposed on us. I was wondering, you can have hearings here at the legislature, but how are you going to deal with these thousands of local governments and how these little citizen groups are going to be engineered?
Road trip. Seriously, what needs to take place is a more openness and receptivity on the part of the press. So the Press Tribune in Roseville, and the Tulsa Star, and all the local papers need to be more receptive to op-eds and other kinds of news articles that paint the more complete picture. You're absolutely right that the local governments, as our esteemed ex-speaker years ago once said, all politics are local. And it's the local folks in Roseville that are forced to implement something, have essentially no authority, but they are going to be ultimately responsible for the chaos. And that's unfortunate. But what is truly needed is better education of 37 million people.
Thank you.
And if I have to do a one-on-one, I'm happy to do it that way.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I just have quite a few little things I want to ask about. So carbon tax, because we're talking about fraud, scientific fraud, and how that may be collapsing our entire system worldwide, and all the carbon tax. Also, how is HARP involved with heating the
I
environment?
think that's probably out of order, that one.
I'm sorry?
HARP is really beyond the scope of this hearing.
Okay, thank you. And geoengineering, I was wondering how that might be involved with the heating of the environment to create global warming.
May I deal just with the first of those, for the sake of brevity, because there are other questions. On the fraud aspect, I think I have avoided using that word during this hearing, but I think that it is possible, on seeing what I've shown you, to conclude that there are elements of fraud in what has been done. That's not to say the whole thing is fraud. It is to say that certain specific scientists have done certain specific narrow things which may be fraudulent and may even constitute racketeering under the Racketeering and International Criminal Organizations. What I propose to do about that is I'll be spending 3 weeks in the centre of RICO, which of course is Chicago, where your president would come from if he didn't come from further afield. I'll be investigating there the possibility of bringing to trial 2 or 3 specific scientists who have, in my opinion, committed frauds, but at this stage, no names, no patron.
Can you stay in California longer? We need you.
I can respond very briefly to your question about geoengineering. There are a lot of scientific concepts that might help mitigate climate change. You know, sending particles up, taking particles out, whatever it is, you know, it's a massive scale. But what it raises is something more important that we need to keep in mind, and that is the value of future knowledge. We took an action in 2006 based upon what we knew at the time, or what we thought we knew at the time. And since that, in the subsequent 6 years, we've learned new stuff that tell us the action we took was wrong. If we can't value future knowledge, why did we value educating our children?
Exactly.
Right? Future knowledge needs to be acted upon as new knowledge. And we're not doing that. And that is philosophically appalling.
He's devastating.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am. And would you guys please identify yourself as well? I apologize.
My name is Orlene Curla, and I am the state president for Eagle Forum of California. We put on a big conference last year in Sacramento about Agenda 21, and this year we're putting on another one on Earth Day. And I truly believe that cap and trade is very much a part of this overall global concept of Agenda 21 that is trying to exercise more control over everyone's lives, how they interact with the environment, and that's definitely through their use of energy. I've also discovered I'm a writer, and I have written a book about the global grid and smart meters and how that all interacts. And in my book, I show Al Gore's web. And he is surrounded by 8 different organizations that he has connection with, where he has definitely a great benefit coming from anything to do with carbon credit trading. He is like the stockbroker that gets the money from that. And I just wondered if you would comment more on that and just how much he actually gets through all of this carbon credit trading.
Well, I'm not privy to Al Gore's finances, but I think that after the court case in October 2007, in which Mr. Justice Burton said that the Armageddon scenario that he depicts in his mawkish sci-fi comedy horror movie is not based on any scientific view, we can take it that Al Gore, although still profiting mightily from this scam, is something of a busted flush. I don't think he is important now. Agenda 21, however, remains important. This is a UN proposal that everything should be subjected in every country to a so-called environmental sustainability agenda.
True.
And that is being implemented with great eagerness by Marxist and socialist and other totalitarian parties around the world. It is a danger because its original intention, when it was thought up by the KGB 30 years ago, was as a means of destroying the West from within. And it still has many of those characteristics, even though, of course, the KGB are no longer there to drive it. So I think we need to be very careful about all these growing trends towards allowing the UN and other supranational or global agencies increasingly to exercise real legislative, executive, and judicial power over us, even though they have not been elected to do so. At the moment, every time we sign a treaty giving more power to the UN, the World Bank, the IMF, the World Law of the Sea Conference, whoever it might be, we are, and even if it is sensible to transfer those powers so that we decide increasingly on global things globally, there is a case for that, then we're at the moment passing power from elected hands here to unelected hands somewhere else. That is in defiance of Article 1, Section 1 of your Constitution, which says all legislative power herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and House of Representatives, period. In other words, all the power to impose taxes on you or inflict laws on you rests only in the hands of those who you have elected to inflict them, and on nobody. Every time the world power gathers its strength and its wealth and its power to intervene at the expense of our governments, democracy dies a little, and there is therefore a necessity now to find a new global constitution which will make sure that there should no more be any transfer of power to any central organization from democratic states unless and until that central organization and all who control it are elected by us, the peoples of the world. Yes.
Sir, I've always been fascinated by the difference between the Arctic and the Antarctic in the growth of the ice. It's receding in the Arctic and growing greater in the Antarctic. Now, an argument's been made to me that this is proof of human-caused global warming because supposedly the northern hemisphere is more heavily industrialized than the southern hemisphere. Can you refute that for me, please?
It is correct that the northern hemisphere is more heavily industrialized than the southern hemisphere because the southern hemisphere is nearly all ocean. So that point I can of course clear up for you. But no, the imbalance in the where you've got warming of the Arctic and cooling of the Antarctic over 30 years since the satellites have been able to watch this, does show that whatever else we're looking at, it is not global warming, and there's no point in trying to pretend that it is. It clearly isn't. Also, if you go back to the records of the United States Bureau of Meteorology for 1922, where they made an expedition to the Arctic, they say there was no ice as far as the eye could see. They had never seen so little ice in these latitudes before. This was a clear sign of global warming, and it was a very worrying concern, and soon there would be no ice left, and then what would happen to the poor polar bears? That was 1922. It was almost certainly warmer and with less ice in the Arctic in the 1920s and all the way up until late in the 30s than it is today. So all that we are really seeing is the swings and roundabouts of a natural climate with perhaps a very small anthropogenic signal overlaid upon it. And frankly, if you come from Scotland, as I do, we could do with all the global warming we could get.
Thank you. Thank you all for questions. I would like to personally thank Mr. Tom. Thank you, Tom, for being here for this testimony. Lord Monckton, it has been a privilege to meet you, and I thank you for coming to all the way to California to help us understand that it is not a man-made issue. And so I really appreciate your participation in this hearing and your 5 days travel throughout this state to educate the people of California on the global warming issue that does not exist based on man-made causes. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. It's been a real